So people will say, in I think just about every country, aside from the US, there are hate speech laws, and people will say, well, here's an example, Holocaust denial. Obviously that's reprehensible. Things like that should be criminalized. And frankly, I find it reprehensible as well, right? And hopefully a lot of people watching do. But the question is, why should we allow that? Why is that necessary in a free speech society?
The public view is that to criminalize hate speech really means to rid the public square of racial epithets and Holocaust denial. The truth is that that's not actually what these laws do. And the truth is that these laws, which claim to, by stopping that kind of speech, getting rid of violence, is also not true. In Europe, the public square is full of hatred. It's just that the hatred is directed against one group, and that is the oppressor group. The legacy populations of those nations, Christians, it's free rein to speak ill of them. So the point of these laws is not to protect everyone. There isn't, even though they are framed as general laws that are equally applicable, the goal is rather to prevent any kind of speech that may do dignitary harm to so-called marginalized groups. But in effect, these laws don't crack down on violence. In fact, they increase it. So I'll give you one example. In England, Jews are 13 times more likely to be subjected to anti-Semitic violence than they are in the United States, which does not criminalize hate speech. In France, it's 4 times as frequently. And again, France does criminalize anti-Semitic hate speech. So the laws actually don't work in the way that it is claimed. In reality, Holocaust deniers are a tiny, discredited, repugnant minority to whom nobody pays attention. But yet, what you do have in America is some semblance of political liberty, where you can discuss almost any question that a free people ought to be able to discuss. Whereas in Europe, that very frequently is not the case. Very frequently, and I'll give you just one example, a member of parliament in Belgium was prevented from holding and running public office for 10 years because he spread pamphlets that were against immigration. Now, whatever one may think of immigration, whether we should have open borders or a totally closed society, everybody must, at a certain level, admit that this is one of these questions upon which the fate of a country depends. And in that particular European country, discussion of it is almost impossible because of these hate speech laws. And so what you have is a large populace that feels this kind of tyranny, that feels the lie that they are told, on the one hand, you're a free society, while being told at the same time, no, you can't deliberate or discuss these kinds of questions. And those people become angry and radicalized. And so there's a great deal of harm that these kinds of laws create, and yet they do not actually fulfill the promise of what they were intended to do.
And this is, being taught in as early as grade school or even earlier in different kinds of manifestations. Like there was a Tucker Carlson episode fairly recently that was talking about, advanced BLM, Black Lives Matter studies as early as 5th grade. One of the elements is, disrupting the Western prescribed nuclear family structure being one of the things that you have to kind of, fight against or purify, as you describe it. It's incredible to me that things like this are taught at that level of schooling.
Well, it is incredible, and yet it makes perfect sense. There's a very interesting writer on the left who is a professor at a Big Ten law school, and he has been there from the beginning of the criminalizing hate speech movement. And he says a very interesting and revealing thing, which is that the civil rights movement, according to him, has been a failure. It's been a failure because, sure, it took away discrimination in public accommodations. Sure, it took away discrimination in employment and in housing, but it didn't accomplish its mission. Its mission was to get rid of discrimination in general. And the last place where discrimination exists is in the minds of the oppressor. The laws in America are almost totally anti-discrimination laws. And so that last front, which according to him is the front where real discrimination exists, is oppressor minds, and essentially, as he basically says it, white minds. Those are his words. And so if that's the case, then he has basically two prescriptions. Number one is education, and as young as possible. And the core goal of that education is basically directed at oppressors, specifically, to get them to understand on the surface their privileges, understand the superstructure that they, consciously or not, partake in and uphold. And at a slightly lower level, or a slightly deeper level, the goal is to get them to despise themselves and to renounce that allegedly oppressive identity. But this writer goes one step further. He, in addition, says that may not be enough. What is needed, in addition, is a fundamental transformation of the oppressor group's culture. And what one must do is change all of society's images, movies, commercials, sitcoms, advertisements, so that, as he says, the marginalized are viewed as heroes, that's his word, and so that the marginalizer or the oppressor is viewed as, if not evil, then somebody that should be ignored and put to the sideline. And the purpose of this, just like in K-12 education, is to take away or distort the identity of the oppressor while building up the self-respect of the so-called marginalized.
Why do you call this a religion?
It has many of the features of, I have some trepidation in saying this, but of religious piety and fanaticism. It says that, as I said, all of history is evil. There is a scapegoat, that is the oppressor group. And to purge the world of evil, to purify it so that the purity of the marginalized can rise up, and so that the good, or as the Bible says, the meek, can inherit the world. There must be this kind of cleansing, purification, purgation. And so one of my colleagues, who's a professor also at Georgetown University, Josh Mitchell, recently wrote a book on this, which I think is very interesting and impressive, where he explains how this is a form of secularized Christianity in this in its apocalyptic nature, in its demand for this kind of purification. But regrettably, it is a Christianity without a God that can forgive. And so it leads to a perpetual struggle that probably necessarily must become violent at some point.
So what's the end game here? Is it for the roles to flip, or how does this work?
I don't think that they have a full answer. In a way, yes, what you said, for the roles to flip. they seem to think that they can be successful in this. And of course, nobody knows. But what they will get with their success will either be, one, great resistance to it, as one already sees manifesting in the country, or it will be some kind of tyranny. And with that tyranny, many things that are good about this country will be lost. Not just political liberty, not just the equal protection of the law, but also a thriving economy will go out the door. So too will scientific progress and innovations go out the door. And you already see an inkling of this bubbling up in the universities today, where the demand is that one's qualifications to being a physicist, a chemist, whatever it is, are tied to being a member of a marginalized group. Well, science does not progress under those conditions. Science progresses when simply the best, no matter what gender, what color skin you have, it doesn't matter. It's the most brilliant minds that make these openings. But when you get rid of that standard, science also starts to first halt and then reverts.
Well, and there's also, it seems to be this element where, if the science doesn't seem to conform to the ideology takes precedence, right? Correct me if I'm wrong here.
Yes, I think that's true. And where you see that most is, look, I've been talking about hate speech for a couple of years. And when I first started this, I would say the following thing, and I'd get looks from the audience like, you're crazy, this isn't possible, but now everybody kind of sees it. And it's this, that certain facts can be viewed as racist, xenophobic, anti-trans, and by virtue of that, even if they are true, they are removed from utterances and attempted to be removed from minds. And this is very much rooted in the identity politics thinking. I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a battle currently going on between medical professionals, doctors, biologists on the one side, and transgender activists on the other side. The medical people, many of whom say, no, sex is by birth. And the transgender activists say, no, it's not at all. It's merely assigned at birth, and we decide what gender we are. Well, it is becoming rather evident that there is a great interest in shutting down those kinds of scientific facts. Even if science claims that they are true, they are still considered transphobic facts. I'll give you another example. Disparities in crime among groups. There is a great push to say, well, it may be true on paper, but it doesn't matter. That should be an unutterable fact. And regrettably, this is where this is going. I think that those that promote, a lot of people that are promoting this kind of ideology think that there are only people of ill will on the other side, and think that by ushering forth these kinds of facts, they are trying to demean, diminish, harm people. And that's simply not true. I think that going on this disparate crime example among groups, I think that every group wants to live in safe neighborhoods. Every American does. And so when you take away the capacity to speak about these facts, you're taking away, in this case, safety in neighborhoods, but ultimately this ability not only to rule yourself by getting rid of problems in your community, but it's a fundamental distortion of the intellect that says that your mind simply should not go there because certain facts are racist or transphobic. And regrettably, a lot of people, I think, underestimate that people that cite these facts are not convinced by these things. They just be quiet, but they grow angrier and angrier in knowing the damage to the truth that is being done.